It's my pleasure now to introduce Jelica Šumič Riha. She's well known here because she's our host of this wonderful conference, and she is, this is an unnecessary repetition, but I nevertheless go through it. She's a professor of philosophy at the postgraduate school of the Research Center of the Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts, and senior research fellow at the Institute of Philosophy. Same research center of the Slovenian Academy of Sciences and Arts. And she was a visiting professor at the University of Essex, at the University Paris 8, at the University of Buenos Aires, and the University of Sao Paulo. In 2002, she conducted a seminar, Le Pour tous face au réel, at the Collège International de Philosophie in Paris, together with Riha, who's present as well, and she has published a number of philosophical works, including Politik der Wahrheit with Alain Badiou, Jacques Rancière, and Riha, at Turia and Kant in Vienna 1997, and then Universel Singulier Sujet with Alain Badiou and others in Paris, and Mutations of Ethics in Slovene, I guess. And then something in Slovene, which I will not try to read out to you. Here's in English, Eternity and Change, Philosophy in Worldless Times. And last but not least, she is working on a forthcoming volume entitled Volonté et Désir. And today she is gonna talk to us about, now the change program brings me totally to, here's the title. Under the title of Mathematics, a dividing line between philosophy and psychoanalysis. So please join me in welcoming our host for her talk this afternoon, Jelica.
So as a way to initiate a discussion on borders in philosophy and psychoanalysis, I want to show the benefits and also at the same time the limits of mathematical formalization in philosophy and psychoanalysis by a discussion of the place of mathematics in Lacan's psychoanalysis and Badiou's philosophy. The advantage of doing this is that the clarification of Lacan's and Badiou's passion for formalization, or the path of the matheme, allows us to understand why, for a thought that is oriented towards the real, such as Lacan's psychoanalysis and Badiou's philosophy, it is the encounter with the impossible stumbling block that challenges the power of thought and presents at the same time an opportunity to create something radically new. To shed some light on this difficult problem, it is necessary to give an account of two different ways of relating to mathematics, Lacan's and Badiou's. My starting point is Badiou's and Lacan's reading of Russell's double definition of pure mathematics. According to the first definition, mathematics presents itself as a set of formal implications independent of any content. In Lacan parlance, we could say that mathematics is the science that coincides entirely with its writing. Mathematics is the science of the letter. Without referring to any external reality or experience, mathematics constitutes a self-referential structure of what the letter is capable of. It is founded on the power of the letter to logically formalize the sui generis mathematical reality rather than represent any given reality whatsoever. According to Russell's second, one is almost tempted to say infamous definition, mathematics is a science in which one never knows what one is talking about, nor whether what one is saying is true. While for Badiou, the ignorance that is supposed to characterize mathematics according to Russell's definition only concerns the role philosophy assigns to mathematics, namely its being identified with the science of being qua being. For Lacan, the ignorance constitutive of mathematics is rather to be seen as a symptom of the love of truth, whose cause is the reduction of truth to a mere truth value, actually to a letter. In focusing on divergences in these two readings of Russell's definition of pure mathematics, I will try to show how the access to psychoanalysis as well as the access to philosophy coincides with a certain access to mathematics, although we are not dealing with the same type of access. What is important for Lacan in mathematics, just as for Badiou incidentally, is not only its structuring power, which consists in giving form to its objects, but the power of breaking with experience and empiricity that is attributed to mathematics, something that already Uroš focused on. Thus, according to Lacan, mathematical discourse cannot be founded on anything other than, to quote Lacan, this language of pure matheme that alone can be thought, this without recourse to any experience. This is a quote from L'Étourdi. This also explains Lacan's famous claim from L'Étourdi encore, once more, formalization is our goal, our ideal. Why? Because formalization as such is a matheme. It can be transmitted integrally, end of quote. Badiou likewise subscribes to the realism of mathematicians, since for him too, mathematics thinks and creates through formalization. This is only possible insofar as mathematics obeys what Badiou calls the principle of maximality, according to which an intellectual entity whose existence can be inferred without contradiction from the axiom prescribing it exists by the very fact. This is a quote from The Immanence of Truth. But unlike mathematicians' realism, and closer to Lacan's peculiar realism, Badiou's realism is also based on a certain resistance experienced in mathematicians' practice. Something resists when you practice mathematics, says Badiou. You come up against a difficulty, unyielding reality. This is from In Praise of Mathematics. And it is on the basis of the resistance of things to thought that we must grasp the real in mathematics. What is important to Badiou is Lacan's choice of the path of the matheme to deal with the question of the real, since he too strives to identify what is subtracted from teleological determination, or in Badiou's terms, what is not being qua being, and which is therefore not mathematizable. For the problem that Badiou seeks to address is similar to Lacan's. I quote, if real ontology is set up as mathematical by evading the norm of the one, there also ought to be a point wherein the ontological, hence mathematical field is detotalized or remains at a dead end. I have called this point the event. This is from The Event as Transbeing. Thus, if philosophy assigns the task of thinking being such to mathematics, it is precisely to establish itself as a general theory of the event. In other words, it is the theory of the impossible proper to mathematics. It is important to note that this distribution of tasks between mathematics and philosophy is itself based on the assumption that not everything is mathematizable. The question that then arises is that of knowing how to formalize the real if the real is impossible to be written. It is precisely on this point that Badiou inevitably encounters Lacan in his attempt to approach the non-formalizable real using mathematics. According to Lacan, if it is necessary to make use of the matheme in psychoanalysis, this is because psychoanalysis deals with a peculiar knowledge that is literalizable as any knowledge, but unlike other modalities of knowledge, it is not known. Like mathematics, psychoanalysis privileges the matheme to reach the real, but unlike mathematics, psychoanalysis targets the remainder of the real that escapes all formalization. As a matter of fact, if there is a domain in which the rigorous formalization has always met obstacles, it is certainly psychoanalysis. Lacan himself ended up by admitting this by saying, the analytic thing will not be mathematical. This is from Encore. Not because of any inherent deficiencies in psychoanalysis, but because the unconscious and the jouissance it programs do not allow the elimination of singularity that mathematics requires. For psychoanalysis, this remainder of the real that cannot be mathematized can be summed up in the formula, there is no sexual relationship. There is only the impossibility of writing it. It is in this sense that Lacan attempts to write the sexual relationship even though he posited its impossibility. And I quote from Italian note, "Without attempting this relationship of writing, there is no means in effect of arriving of what I, at the same time as I posited its inexistence, proposed as a goal by which psychoanalysis might make itself the equal of science, namely, to prove that this relationship is impossible to write, or that it is not affirmable, but moreover not refutable under the heading of truth, with the consequence that there is no truth of which one can say all. The truth is of no use except to create the place from which this knowledge is exposed. But the analyst's knowledge is not nothing. For what is at stake is that reaching the real, it determines it just as much as the knowledge of science." End of quote. What is aimed at in Lacanian maxims is therefore neither of the order of the true, not of the order of knowledge, but the real that manifests itself in the form of the encounter, of the deadlock, of the non-relation. This is why what the maxim aims at is not the real as such, but the impossibility of spelling out the truth about the real. As a way of circumscribing the real, the maxim goes straight to the heart of Badiou's preoccupations, and more particularly, his self-assigned task of re-entwining philosophy and mathematics. So, where exactly Lacan and Badiou separate while sometimes crossing each other nevertheless? In the case of Lacan, the fact of drawing inspiration from the mathematical model does not amount to confusing two modes of the real, a real that sets mathematicians to work, or the real as the cause of the work of formalization, and the real that is generated by this formalization, or more precisely, by its failure. Badiou's critique of Lacan's particular relationship to mathematics takes as its starting point what he calls a triangulation, which includes psychoanalysis, mathematics, and philosophy. What characterizes Lacan's approach to mathematics depends on the rather specific status that he assigns to the maxim. For Lacan, the maxim ensures integral transmission of knowledge precisely because it is being emptied of meaning. It is this feature that the maxim in psychoanalysis and the mathematizable have in common. In L'Étourdi, Lacan explains that he has mathematized his discourse in order to be thought. As he puts it explicitly, the unteachable I turned into a maxim. But what exactly is a maxim for Lacan? To identify the maxim with the teachable inevitably replaces and displaces at the same time the mathematizable. The real for Lacan can only be reached by mathematics, except the real of the impossible sexual relation, which cannot be inscribed by any mathematical relation. What is important to note here is that Lacan's maxim goes beyond the mathematizable because the real of there is no sexual relationship can only be signaled by the emphasis of the mathematizable. This is why Lacan can state, this is why the mathematics on the basis of which the mathematizable, itself definable as what can be taught of the real, is formulated in emphasis, are likely to be coordinated with this absence from the real. This is a quote from L'Étourdi. What Lacan calls the absence from the real is nothing other than the real proper to psychoanalysis. There is no sexual relationship, which must be distinguished from the real that can be written and thus taught by means of the maxims. It is this real whose absence is to be understood, according to Badiou, as its absence in any mathematization, or in other words, its absence in writing. What would be the equivalent of this absence in writing for mathematics? To follow Cantor's conception of mathematics that both Lacan and Badiou share, the reality of mathematics is grounded in the constraint of coherence. If formalization consists in a putting in relation, the real arises as the impossibility of such putting in relation, indeed, as an impossible relation. Consequently, the real in mathematics can only emerge at those points where coherence is lacking. It is at precisely this level that Lacan seeks the real in mathematics, the real in the formalization itself. The real we are dealing with here is the real that can only be inscribed on the basis of an impasse of formalization. And it is precisely concerning this real that Badiou formulates his objections to Lacan. Lacan's position is, in Badiou's view, an archi-scientific one. According to Badiou's reading of Lacan's articulation of the real and the matheme, this articulation is not tenable if one does not introduce the point of a real of the real. The formulation, the real of the real, which is nowhere to be found in Lacan's work, as Badiou readily admits, plays a strategic role in Badiou's own argument, since it allows him to clarify how, according to Lacan, psychoanalysis and philosophy are respectively positioned in relation to mathematics. Thus, to follow Badiou, in order to situate the place of psychoanalysis in relation to mathematics, the real, as Lacan conceives it, has to be doubled. The real proper to science, this being the real whose laws science discovers and then writes down in formulae, this real can be mathematized and transmitted by way of the matheme. And there is the real proper to psychoanalysis, the non-mathematizable real that can only be written on the basis, on the emphasis of mathematization. On Badiou's reading, what Lacan is looking for is precisely this point of impossibility in mathematics itself, since it allows him to isolate the non-mathematizable real. For Badiou, Lacan's matheme is archi-scientific and non-scientific, because it is situated at the point of the real of mathematics. And Badiou concludes it can't be mathematics precisely because it touches the real of mathematics itself. Now, it is exactly this distinction between two modes of the real that, in Lacan's view, separates psychoanalysis from philosophy. By not being able to touch the real of mathematics, philosophy remains, at least according to Lacan, blocked by mathematics. Now, the very fact of having granted the status of thought to mathematics, because for Lacan only mathematics is capable of touching the real, is an opportunity for Lacan to criticize philosophy, which is incapable of recognizing in mathematics the path of the access to the real, and for this very reason remains blocked by mathematics. If Badiou rejects outright the idea of the real thus doubled, it is because he defends the thesis according to which, if there is a locus of thought that is blocked by itself, it is surely mathematics. And the reason for this self-blocking of mathematics, according to Badiou again, is the ignorance or unawareness of mathematics concerning its own ontological significance. This thesis allows Badiou to shed light on his main point of disagreement with Lacan. Philosophy, Badiou claims, instead of being blocked by mathematics, is on the contrary, the dead discourse that identifies in mathematics a blocking point when it comes to its ontological nature has been trying since Plato to unblock it. In this respect, the philosopher is not someone who is blocked by mathematics, as Lacan maintains, but someone who attempts to unblock it with regard to itself. The question that Badiou poses at this point concerns the real thinking dimension of mathematics, that philosophy, according to Lacan, fails to grasp. Badiou finds the answer to this question in L'Étourdi, where Lacan claims, precisely concerning mathematics, that, I quote, the said is constantly renewed by taking its subject from a saying rather than from any reality, end of quote. The neuralgic point of Lacan's argument can be found in the dialectic of saying and the said. To quote Lacan, it is when a saying emerges that does not always go as far as to be able to exist in the said that a certain real may be reached. This is the end of quote from L'Etourdi. This is because the saying on which the said depends constitutes, according to Lacan, an event in the sense that it introduces a cut, a division of before and after. But for a saying to be acknowledged as such and become effective as an event, it must be submitted to the test of its consequences, which is to say, to the test of the said. And it is only after passing this test that a certain real may be reached. Badiou agrees with Lacan that the saying must occur to be able to transform or to renew the said. This is specifically the case in mathematics, because mathematics, in relating to the saying, relates to a reality that is immanent to it. According to Lacan, it is precisely this point that philosophy, in its relation to mathematics, necessarily misses, since philosophy, instead of situating the renewal of the said in the saying, situates it in meaning. In trying to give meaning to truth, says Lacan, philosophy fails to recognize the true nature of mathematics. Philosophy refuses to accept that mathematics consists in a meaningless saying that is realized as an absolute, integrally transmissible said. Philosophy misses what Lacan calls the paradigmatic value of mathematics, which lies in, if we are to follow Lacan, in its being the unsurpassable model of a thought that has no meaning. But it is curious, as Badiou himself points out, that on this point, an anti-philosopher, Lacan, can join a philosopher, Plato, however, with one essential difference. What Lacan identifies as the paradigmatic value of mathematics is precisely what Plato criticizes it for. Plato's objection to mathematics is that it functions based on hypotheses that it does not account for. Translated into Lacan's terms, Plato would realize before Lacan that mathematics is based on a pure saying and that mathematics is only guaranteed by a saying, which Badiou translates as the axiomatic dimension of mathematics. While criticizing mathematics, Plato would disagree with Lacan since he too identifies the primacy of the saying, from which the elimination of meaning follows. If philosophy is the domain where the dialectic of meaning is played out, mathematics is the domain of the prescription of the saying, which is not supported by any guarantee of necessity. The event of the saying can therefore only be eventual and contingent, according to Badiou. But because it does not derive from reality, paradoxically, it is absolutely necessary, more precisely, as Badiou emphasizes, necessary under the authority of the saying. Thus, having identified mathematics as being under the law of the saying, philosophy must recognize the constitutive paradox of mathematics, namely the nexus between contingency and necessity. Having based his philosophical project on the thesis of the identity of mathematics and ontology, i.e., having affirmed that philosophy is under the condition of the events of mathematics, Badiou establishes a completely different relation to mathematics than Lacan with respect to psychoanalysis. Seen from this perspective, philosophy's link to mathematics consists in its acceptance of mathematics as the possible instigator of an unprecedented determination of philosophy itself. As a condition of philosophy, mathematics is considered here as the power of a free and secularized thought capable of creating a radical novelty. And it is in the context of this attempt to reconnect with mathematics that Badiou criticizes Lacan's use of mathematics. The triangulation of mathematics, philosophy, and psychoanalysis would thus be, according to Badiou, a singular articulation created by Lacan to demarcate his use of mathematics from philosophies. Now, Badiou too needs such a triangulation to bring to light the way in which philosophy, the general theory of eventual truth, approaches mathematics identified with the thought of being. And he too makes reference to the impasses of mathematical formalization, which prove that mathematics having come across an impossibility of its own, is founded on a real. Now, Badiou also recognizes that there is an unwritable real in Kantorian mathematics. More precisely, he sets out from the idea that there is no measurable, numerable relation between the countable and the uncountable, or the continuous, between the set of elements of a set and the set of its parts. But if he acknowledges that there is an unwritable real in mathematics, this is to ensure the compatibility between philosophy as the thought of the eventuality of truth and ontology, which is mathematics, as the thought of the multiple being. It should be noted that in his attempt to re-entwine philosophy and mathematics, Badiou is forced to fight on several fronts: against philosophers that do not recognize mathematics as creative thought, Heidegger, for example, against anti-philosophers that relegate mathematics to unthought, for instance, Wittgenstein, and against Lacan's rather singular anti-philosophy that grants mathematics the status of thought, since for him only mathematics is capable of touching the real. However, what Badiou finds specifically problematic in Lacan's approach to mathematics can be seen in the fact that Lacan grants mathematics this privilege only on the condition of arrogating to himself the right to identify the point at which mathematics fails, the point of impossibility or the point of the non-mathematizable real, which cannot be written down in mathematical formulae and which can therefore only manifest itself through the impulses of formalization. Now, what is the main objection that Badiou addresses to Lacan? That he took the position vis-à-vis mathematics that Badiou characterizes as archi-scientific in order to identify the point of the impossible that cannot be surpassed in mathematics, the real of mathematics, as Badiou designates it. Following Badiou's reading of Lacan, one is almost tempted to say that by circumscribing the non-mathematizable real within mathematics itself, Lacan's aim was ultimately to pronounce the truth of the real of mathematics. In the end, and regardless of the points of convergence that I have tried to mark out, Badiousian philosophy and Lacanian psychoanalysis do not and cannot have the same recourse to mathematics. For Lacan, mathematics occupies a privileged place among those disciplines in which psychoanalysis cannot afford not to be interested. However, it is also important to stress that mathematics does not constitute one of the conditions of psychoanalysis, at least not in the sense in which Badiou assigns to this notion. Lacan turns to mathematics in order to ensure psychoanalysis' orientation towards the real and to identify the real proper to psychoanalysis, in order to be able to produce a knowledge that can be transmitted to all by way of maxims. However, psychoanalysis does not depend on mathematics, and Freud's invention of psychoanalysis proves it. This, however, is not the case for Badiou. In contrast to psychoanalysis, philosophy, at least as Badiou conceives it, does depend on the events that have taken place and will take place in mathematics, because it is only on the basis of such events that new truths are generated, those truths that it is the task of philosophy to think. In this respect, philosophy is not and cannot be indifferent to what takes place in the thought of being qua being. Consequently, as Badiou himself acknowledges, not every mathematics, which for him is identified with ontology, is compatible with philosophy of eventual truth. In fact, only a mathematics capable of identifying in thinking the points of the impossible, its real, which takes the form of its impasses, aporias, difficulties, provides the necessary space for events to take place in mathematics. It should then be argued that philosophy, under conditions, depends not only on the truth that these conditions produce, but that it depends even more on the real of its conditions, and specifically on the real of the equation mathematics is ontology. Badiou himself gives us an idea of this dependence of philosophy on the real of mathematics. Let me quote the key passage in Being of Event and Event. Since its very origin, in anticipation of its Kantorian grounding, philosophy has interrogated the abyss which separates numerical discretion from the geometrical continuum. We can now say that it is being itself, flagrant with the impulse of ontology, which organizes the inexhaustibility of its thought, given that no measure may be taken of the quantitative bond between a situation and its state, between belonging and inclusion. Everything leads us to believe that it is forever that this provocation to the concept, this unrelation between presentation and representation will be open in being. If the real is the impossible, the real of being, being will be precisely what is detained by the enigma of an anonymity of quantity, end of quote. The errancy of being, referred to by Badiou, is intolerable for thought. Thought cannot be satisfied with an ontologically proven unmeasure, but aims instead at measuring the excess, at pinpointing being where it is no longer exactly sayable. To clarify this rather opaque point, Badiou examines three strategies of thought, three orientations of ontological thought, as he puts it, to remedy this excess, to say the impossible to say of ontology, the way of the constructible, the way of large cardinals, and the way of the generic. While the constructible path and the path of large cardinals seek to bring the real of ontology under control, either from below, i.e. by reducing multiplicities to the constructible, or from above, by formulating hypotheses of the existence of gigantic cardinals in order to prescribe what Badiou calls a hierarchical disposition in which nothing will be able to err. The challenge of the generic path, by contrast, is not to reduce or control the excess, but to rejoin it. Yet to ensure the compatibility of philosophy as the general theory of the eventuality of truth and ontology, the science of being, it is not enough to simply choose the generic path. It is also necessary to anticipate that the demonstration of the continuum hypothesis, which postulates that cardinality of R, the continuum of the set, or the set of real numbers, is the immediate successor of the cardinality of N, the countable or the set of integers, will never be validate its truth. Philosophy, as Badiou conceives it, requires an ontology capable of guaranteeing forever, as it were, that there would be new eventual contingencies in which truth, including those of ontology, will originate. The immanence of truth takes up and renews this questioning started in Being an Event, a questioning focusing on the undecidable status of the continuing hypothesis. Badiou opts, as always, for its falsity. The theory of large cardinals, located in the camp of the former adversary with Jensen's theorem, which makes it possible to determine the power of a set, named zero sharp, seems to confirm the soundness of Badiou's choice. It is important to emphasize that the hypothesis that Badiou himself makes about the continuum hypothesis, namely about its ultimate falsity, is based on nothing more than a wager on the real. Just like the real of psychoanalysis, namely that there is no sexual relation, which is unsurpassable real for psychoanalysis, the proper real of mathematics is supposed to constitute the unsurpassable horizon for ontology, if it is to be compatible with philosophy, the thought of the eventual truth. Thus, what Badiou is looking for is an analog of the real of psychoanalysis, and he finds it in a double form, that of the supposed falsity of the continuing hypothesis on the one hand, and on the other, that of the supposed existence of a zero-sharp set. In both cases, it is a question of a wager on the existence of unconstructible infinite sets. The problem that Jensen's covering lemma, as Badiou calls it, solves is the following. I quote from The Immanence of Truth. There exists a set called zero-sharp such that if it does not exist, covering is always possible. And if it does exist, the covering of certain large multiplicities is impossible, end of quote. However, as with the continuing hypothesis, the existence of zero-sharp set is not provable in set theory. The existence of zero-sharp is based on a decision, says Badiou, one that declares its existence at the risk that the whole structure of formal ontology may collapse, as he puts it in The Immanence of Truth. Paradoxically, this risk must be accepted by the choice that strives for creation or emancipation. Ultimately, all creative thought, according to Badiou, is compelled to take the existence of zero-sharp as an axiom in order to be able to go beyond the finitist framework of the given situation. So what is the lesson to be learned from the detailed examination of the theory of large cardinals presented in The Immanence of Truth? Badiou's response is as follows. To wager on the existence of zero-sharp should be considered to be a weapon with which to wage a successful battle in concrete situations. And to wage this battle successfully, it is necessary to, and I quote, define the threshold, which is also the battleground. We need to think the complete infinity, which tells us that not everything is subject to finitude, but also think and practice zero-sharp, which tells us where the exit from the old world occurs. And the convoluted, complex, exhausting aspects of this where, infected as it is by the laws of the old world, but also illuminated by the new infinity, cannot be avoided, end of quote. Thus, if mathematics can create a new possibility for philosophy, it can only do so thanks to the contingency of what the mathematical saying produces there. But the new possibility that mathematics create is not just a matter of demonstration, but requires an act that is without guarantee. Here we face again the dialectic of the saying and the said, or for Badiou, the dialectic of the act and the work. Just as was the case for Lacan, for whom it is through the trial of the said and that the status of the true act, just as was the case for Lacan, for whom it is through the trial of the said that the status of a true act of the creative, innovating saying is assured, for Badiou, and I quote from The Immanence of Truth, acts are nothing if they are not themselves also works. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, questions? Christian Fehrens, please. I don't know the microphone where it. Oh, you have it.
Thank you very much for this lecture and this paper who ask very important questions. But I would like to make some comments about the position of Badiou, which in my opinion are not at all Lacanian, in contradiction with Lacan theory. And in several points, I will propose several points which has to be discussed, of course. First, the conception of the matheme. For Badiou, it seems that the matheme is the use of a mathematical device. Mm-hmm. And for me, I think that it is not the case. When Lacan speaks of matheme, I think it is in accordance with Plato, the Menon of Plato, where it is the slave who finds the solution to the problem of a square with a side 1, and which is the size of a diagonal. And so the slave finds the solution. And so it is completely possible to transmit the solution because it does the solution itself, and it's the only way to have a completely transmissible solution, a transmissible knowledge. For me, it is this kind of thing. And so the possibility to transmit a knowing or how to do with things and so on is possible not only for the mathematician, but for everyone, and so, for example, for each analysand. In theory, of course, it must be practiced so. But so there is a big difference between the matheme by Lacan and the matheme by Badiou, I think. And the matheme of Lacan are not always mathematical solutions. There are failure in the mathematics. So, first point. Second point, the conception of the real. I think that for Badiou, the real is more or less the same as the real of reality. And for Lacan, on the contrary, it is quite opposite, I think, as I think the first lecture this afternoon showed it clearly. And in this sense, we have a contradiction between the position of Badiou and Lacan, and I thought Badiou found this contradiction. It was about, I don't remember, but it was about a kind of infinity, and Lacan, who spoke about it, said it was depending on the manner to find it. And Badiou said, not at all. It was a reality. So the infinity, I don't remember what reality it was, but it was a reality, and its reality existed before the mathematician found it. And that is in opposition clearly with the position of Lacan. And I think Lacan, in the point of view of Lacan, is quite right. This kind of thing depends on the manner to finding it. And so we have with Badiou a position of transcendental realism. We can say, we can see it in his follower Meillassoux. In his book, it's clearly that it's a pure realism in the sense that it's criticized by Lacan, by Kant at the beginning of his critique of a pure reason. And so Badiou can speak about the real of real, but it does not make sense for Lacan. It is like a meta-language, and it does not make sense. And my last remark is that Badiou adequate ontology with mathematics. And it is obvious that in the being and the event, for example, the mathematics of Badiou is just depending on the set theory. It does not make any place for the categorical mathematics. It was exposed in the latest lecture of this morning. So I think there is a great discrepancy between Badiou and Lacan, and I think Badiou does not take stock of the advances of the real of Lacan, of the matheme of Lacan, and of the manner of thinking of Lacan. So it's, I think, although it seems quite similar, it's quite different. It is another world, Badiou and Lacan, in my opinion. And I think it's very important for me to follow Lacan because it's much, much more in accordance with what we can think and practice in our meeting of the people, for example, in psychoanalysis. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for your critical remarks. Regarding the first remark that what Badiou is aiming at is that he is, in a sense, too dependent on a mathematical conception of the mathematizable, which is not quite the same thing as Lacan's concept of the matheme. I think that Badiou is Badiou is aware of this distinction, but where he identifies the convergence between his and Lacan's conception of the matheme and the use of the matheme is that, of course, as you have pointed out, it's not the same thing as the slave in Plato's Meno who finds a solution to the problem. And although it is one person who finds, one subject who finds this solution, it is nevertheless transmissible to all. And this is precisely what Badiou is interested in. Even if it is singular, it is transmissible to all. And for him, what is important to see how Lacan, although psychoanalysis deals with singularities and not with universality or generality, nevertheless, the status of the solution, insofar as it can be translated into a matheme, is teachable to all. So it's integrally transmitted. And it is integrally transmitted precisely to the extent that there is a break with experience, break with meaning. And this is the point where Badiou sees the convergence between Lacan's and his use of mathematics. And I would very much, emphasize this convergence. Regarding the second point about, whether there is a space in Badiou's thought for the Lacanian conception of the real. Well, of course, we cannot say Badiou's concept of the real is the same as Lacan's concept of the real, because they are not dealing, it's not the same logic of thinking and not of the same problematic that they deal with. So we cannot, make a sort of a straight equation between those two approaches. Nevertheless, I would insist that Badiou has a concept of the real in the sense of impossibility, stumbling block, which is why he would say, although this is going back to the question, what is the ontological status or reality of mathematical objects? How can one say that it is valid for all if it is created by, for instance, Cantor? How can transfinite numbers be valid for all if it is created by Cantor? How can this be, if it does not have an independent reality, before Cantor's invention? And I think for Badiou, what is, he is a Cantorian in the sense, if there is no contradiction, then it obviously, forces us to accept its existence, So the fact that it was created or produced by a human mind or thought does not contradict the existence and reality of those objects. Now, concerning the real and reality, I would disagree with you. I don't think that Badiou has a transcendental conception of reality, but how to pinpoint exactly the difference between his conception of the real and Lacan's conception of the real, it is really a complex question. Of course, he's not dealing in such details with the real in Lacan's sense, which is, I mean, I think he is quite happy with coming to a conclusion. The real is something to deal with points of impossibilities, which for him is an opportunity to produce, create something new truth in mathematics, for instance, which is why he would say mathematics has, a future in the sense of possibility of creating new radical novelties on which philosophy will depend, So I do think, that Badiou has a concept of the real which is to a certain extent compatible with Lacan's, but it is not the same concept of the real. Why he criticizes Lacan's, what he says, Lacan's doubling of the real of the real, I think what he finds problematic in Lacan's is, his attempt to situate psychoanalysis in relation to mathematics and at the same time to criticize philosophy as having not the same relation to mathematics or not giving or not being capable of grasping the true nature of mathematics is something which Badiou finds questionable, because for him it is only on the condition that Lacan assumes that psychoanalysis is capable of identifying the points of the real impossibility in mathematics, that psychoanalysis can produce the concept of the real for itself, for psychoanalysis. And I think that Badiou finds this problematic, because the price to be paid for this is that he is more or less accused, Lacan is more or less accused of adopting the position of a meta-discourse, because the real of the real, spelling out the truth of the real is in a sense the possibility, in a sense the position of a meta-discourse. So yeah, there is something of, that what you were saying. I forgot what was the third remark that you made about Lacan's reading of... Oh, yes. Well, yeah, he is more Kantorian than, he does make use of category theory in his second volume, but he was, criticized for still insisting on set theory, and which repeats in the immanence of truth. He's going back to set theory and, But I think this is something which, mathematicians have to deal with, and I can see, the logic of Badiou's thinking, why this approach, why this privileging of set theory is important for him, but does it does it put into question, his use of mathematics? I am not so sure.
Okay. Jana Berenkova.
Yeah, nothing special. I just wanted to also contest, like your comment, but I think Jelica said it way better perhaps than I would do. Maybe I just on the side, I would add that, for instance, the question of transmissibility, that you say that it's not existing in Badiou, I think it's really in the core. Actually, when I was listening to you talking about the Menon of Plato, I first thought that you were talking about Badiou's conception of the matim, because he actually insistently quotes Menon of Plato and this notion of transmissibility. I think it's even in our interviews and on various other places it has been published. So I actually at first thought that you were describing Badiou's notion of matim. So that's why I kind of would like to oppose that. I would to disagree with that. And as for the mapping of the psychoanalytic concepts of like the real on Badiou's system, well, again, I don't know how useful it really is, because obviously these terms, for someone like Lacan, they have a certain efficacy even for understanding the clinical practice. And Badiou, just like, I think there are terms like being, for instance, can be seen as structurally analogous, to the real. But to say that there is a theory of the real in Badiou, I don't really know if that makes much sense. I think there are certain terms, like for instance the inexhaustible being and so on, that can be seen as analogous, but not like literally. It just doesn't work to me.
Yeah, there is no attempt to translate. Well, although he was no doubt influenced, and he does, repeat on constantly that he is one of, Lacan's. He said mon maître, and so Lacan was definitely very important for his, development of his philosophy. The position that, his position is not Lacan's position. That's clearly the case.
Should we follow up by Christian Fierens? Yeah, of course. Just waiting for the microphone.
Yes, yes. Thank you for your remark. But for transmissibility, I think I wanted to emphasize that the transmissibility is not depending of mathematical discourse, and that we can find it in the psychoanalysis, and that the impossibility, which is the only way to encounter the real for Lacan, is not necessarily and not mainly mathematical. And so we can encounter the real in the practice of psychoanalysis, in the main practice of psychoanalysis, and we can reach the 4 forms of impossibility in the practice of psychoanalysis. And that is more important than mathematical discourse. For example, we can reach the incompleteness, the incoherence, the impossible to demonstrate, and the impossible to decide. And we encounter this impossibility regularly in the psychoanalysis without any reference to the mathematical. So I think that, of course, the mathematical discourse is interesting, but mainly for psychoanalysis and mainly for Lacan, I would say, the encounter of impossibility is not just mathematical. And so it's important to emphasize this, in my opinion, at least.
Do you want to reply? Still, so yeah. Okay, one more question.
I think I could manage without the mic. I'm just struggling without it. Thank you for this.
I guess it's for the you're being recorded or.
Very insightful talk, Jelica. I just want to have one remark and one provocative question. The remark is, yes, that now with the real, I think that a lot of emphasis is now going on to the mathematical real of Albert Lautmann. There is a lot of talk now going on with his dialectics of these dichotomies, of local, global, and this is the part that is mathematizable and it can be resolved, can get put into practice, aside from the part that is not mathematizable. But my provocative question would be, how would you think, if you have the proposition, real is the impulse of the formalization, or the other way around, whichever you take, Badiou or Lacan, what if it weren't for Gödel in the 30s and the impossibility and completeness theorems weren't developed? How would you think that the entire argument would develop to the point where we are now? Does it have any connection with this at all, or wouldn't make a difference?
Well, I think, one of the things that Badiou emphasized, for instance, in his Century seminar, is that the fact that in mathematics, mathematicians have not found a solution, or there is a failure in formalization. That does not mean that it is a final failure, so we have to abandon, but there is also an opportunity in the future that, a new formalization will be found, so yeah. It's difficult to say what would be if in the 30s, this kind of solution was, feasible. Yeah, it is one of the contingencies, eventual contingencies. Yeah.
Okay. If there are no further questions, I would close this session. Thanking you for your discussion and for your talk again.